In a crowd, the individual vanishes, consciousness dissolves, and a new collective mind is born with fervent, impulsive, and easily swayed instincts. That passage is not just a dry observation. It's like a mirror, forcing people to confront an uncomfortable truth when standing amidst a sea of others. Individual intelligence is drained, replaced by a different power, both blind and irresistible. Gustave Le Bon's ** book, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind **, published in the late 19th century, became one of the most haunting texts on how crowds operate. This work is neither a eulogy for collective power nor a mere critique. It's like a deep dissection into humanity's shared unconscious, revealing that crowds can build civilizations but also possess the force to plunge entire societies into darkness. In the modern world, where people are constantly surrounded by slogans, images, and news amplified and repeated endlessly, this book remains incredibly relevant. Social media, politics, economics all operate on the foundation of crowd psychology that Le Bon analyzed over a century ago. The spread of rumors, the power of concise slogans, the prestige of leaders, aren't these all replaying what he once warned about? So, what is the question posed to each person listening to these analyses? In moments of collective cheering, hands clapping, voices shouting, hearts full of fervor, do we ever ask ourselves if we are truly deciding or merely echoing the thousands around us? The greatest paradox lies here. Humans both crave freedom and are ready to lose it at the call of the collective. Everyone wants to believe they are independent individuals, but with just one powerful enough slogan, one haunting image, all boundaries immediately vanish. Is it possible that what we call individual freedom is merely a thin veneer, constantly at risk of being stripped away in an instant? This book doesn't offer a formula to control crowds, nor does it advise avoiding the collective. It merely gently lifts the curtain for people to see another side of themselves. In that space, we are no longer rational individuals, but fragments of a colossal mind. A mind that can either flourish or destroy, depending on the fire ignited within it. The lingering question for the reader, the listener, the observer is, when standing in a crowd, how much of us still belongs to ourselves, and how much has been dissolved into the anonymous whole? A crowd is not merely a collection of bodies jostling in a square or on a street. Physical presence alone is insufficient to transform discrete individuals into a collective entity. It is only when an invisible current flows through them, causing their emotions and thoughts to converge in one direction, that the so-called collective mind is formed. At that point, each person is no longer themselves, but merely a fragment drawn towards an unseen center. The conscious ego that governs individual life immediately dissolves. In its place, a collective mind emerges, not long-lasting but profoundly distinct. It operates by a harsh law, the law of mental unity. Scholar or laborer, aristocrat or commoner, once swept into a crowd, all fall into an eerie state of conformity. Differentiated intellect blurs, leaving only the rawest emotions. The mechanism creating this state primarily lies in anonymity. In a crowd, individuals no longer feel responsible. Names, reputations, and the control of conscience vanish. An invisible sense of power surges forth. I can do what I wouldn't dare to do alone because no one recognizes me anymore. And when responsibility disappears, deep-seated instincts erupt, whether a desire for violence or a yearning for sacrifice. Next is the contagion of emotion, like fire touching a dry straw bale. A gesture, a shout, an action can spread instantly. This contagion is hard to explain, but people feel it distinctly. It's like a phenomenon of collective hypnosis where individual will is obscured, leaving only synchronized movements. Even the naturally cautious will rush into action simply because everyone around them is doing it. The most decisive factor is suggestion. In a state of being drawn into the collective rhythm, individual intellect is paralyzed, leaving only the easily swayed unconscious. A command, a slogan, an image can entirely dominate. At that moment, the individual no longer questions, but merely accepts and transforms the suggestion into action. This is precisely why a crowd can commit acts completely contrary to the usual character of its individual members. A gentle person can kill, a coward can become a hero. In just an instant, intellect in a crowd sharply declines, while fervor skyrockets. One might imagine it as humans regressing to a lower rung of evolution. Complex thought gives way to instinctive reflexes, but the paradox lies here. This very regression allows crowds to create extraordinary actions, sometimes crimes, sometimes great achievements. Historians have recorded strange moments. A parliament, originally comprised entirely of intellectuals, when united approved horrifying decisions that no individual among them would ever accept. A disparate group of commoners, swept up in a fervor of faith, could sacrifice their lives for an abstract ideal. That irrationality doesn't reside within individuals, but in the very nature of the crowd. From this, another paradox emerges. The crowd is both a danger and a source of strength. It can drag civilizations backward, sowing destruction, but it can also ignite great uprisings, performing actions far beyond individual capacity. In a state of collective hypnosis, people become machines, both dangerous and miraculous. Crowds, therefore, cannot be judged by conventional standards. They are neither absolutely foolish nor consistently heroic. They are simply a space where the common unconscious is amplified and guided. If the suggestion zone is hatred, it becomes a slaughterhouse. If the suggestion zone is loyalty or a yearning for justice, it becomes a locomotive charging towards sacrifice in the shadows of the square. In the surging echo of thousands of shouts, each individual is swept away from themselves. People imagine a crowd to be the sum of many individuals. In reality, it is the birth of an entirely different organism, living by a collective pulse, thinking through synchronized reflexes. Just as cells combine to form an organism, something new emerges, completely different from its individual parts. Therefore, anyone who wishes to understand the power of history, to grasp why great events erupt, must look directly into the nature of the crowd. It is here, where intellect wanes and the unconscious rises, that humanity's most unexpected movements are conceived. When observing a moving crowd, the most obvious characteristic is impulsiveness. It's like a colossal beast whose mood changes in a blink. Moments of joyful cheering can instantly turn to rage, and enthusiastic welcomes can transform into destructive smashing. This lack of restraint isn't because individuals suddenly become erratic, but because in the synchronized rhythm, individual reason is obscured, reacting only to immediate emotions. This impulsiveness is accompanied by an easy susceptibility to redirection. A crowd can be enraged by a figure one moment, but with a strong signal from another direction, they will immediately turn, hail, and praise the very person they had just denounced something an individual would ponder for hours. Crowds can reverse course in mere seconds. The power of suggestion makes crowds credulous and easily led. If just one person speaks with strong conviction, a story, however outlandish, can be accepted as truth by the entire crowd. Images, symbols, and gestures often persuade them more than any logical argument. Thus, collective evidence, the unanimous testimony of many witnesses, is often the worst kind of proof. When an illusion spreads, the crowd sees what doesn't exist and collectively claims to have witnessed it firsthand. Emotions within a crowd are always exaggerated. They know no caution or half measures. They love passionately and hate blindly. Skepticism, the prerogative of independent intellect, is almost non-existent in this collective environment. There is only absolute trust or absolute denial. For this very reason, a movement that takes root easily in a crowd assumes the form of a faith, tolerating no dissent. The paradox is that crowds are both extremely autocratic and rigidly conservative. They can rise up to dismantle an institution, shatter a monument, yet simultaneously cling fiercely to old beliefs, defending them blindly. They might applaud temporary reforms, only to revert to protecting traditional customs afterward. It's as if the fear of losing the familiar outweighs the desire for novelty. The morality of a crowd is an unpredictable variable. At times, they descend to a level lower than individual criminals, cheering at executions or barbaric killings. But at other times, they elevate morality to a standard that no individual among them could ever achieve, sacrificing their lives to protect an ideal, willingly yielding personal interests for a common belief. For this reason, a crowd can never be simply defined as good or evil. It is a magnifying mirror, reflecting both the most contemptible and the most noble aspects of humanity. A peculiar point is that in a crowd, personal interests no longer dictate behavior. People rarely calculate what they gain or lose. They merge into a common rhythm, acting as if there is only a single self. A timid person, when alone, might tremble with fear, but in a crowd, they rush forward boldly because there is no longer a sense of I, only we. It is this dissolution that gives rise to actions that, when reflected upon soberly later, individuals find hard to believe they committed. The emotions of a crowd are thus a double-edged sword. If guided by hatred, they become a ferocious pack of wolves. But if roused by compassion, they can become an altruistic collective, forgetting themselves entirely. History has witnessed both these extremes. Horrific massacres and waves of self-sacrificing heroism in war all stem from the same psychological law. In that rhythm, the crowd becomes an entity both terrifying and admirable. It can bury reason, but it can also elevate emotion. It can destroy, but it can also create. Everything depends on the current of suggestion flowing through the collective's bloodstream at that moment. In a crowd, ideas are born in a way utterly different from individual minds. While individuals typically rely on a chain of arguments, evidence, and comparisons, a crowd leaps from an image to a sweeping conclusion. A single event can immediately be generalized into a universal truth. They don't need many examples. A single instance is enough for them to believe in a rule. Therefore, the reasoning of a crowd is often rudimentary, resembling instinctive association. A child sees the sunset and believes it will never return. That's the type of thinking crowds often carry. Continuity, causality, objective evidence, none of these are familiar tools in the collective intellect. This explains why eloquent, multi-layered arguments rarely persuade them. Conversely, a concise slogan, a highly evocative image, a dramatic story easily penetrates and takes root. Words in the speaker's hand at that moment are no longer instruments of reason, but arrows flying directly into the imagination. Imagination is the greatest door open to a crowd. It can transform the absurd into the obvious and the non-existent into vivid reality. A skilled orator doesn't need much evidence, they just need to paint a picture in the collective mind. This imagination is often concrete and visual, not abstract. They are easily swayed by the image of a martyr, a fluttering flag, a magnificent structure, rather than statistics or complex theorems. A notable paradox: individual critical intelligence is paralyzed by the crowd, but the creative power of imagination is amplified. This enables crowds to generate collective myths. They not only believe in events but also weave a sacred aura around them. And then, in their eyes, the mythical becomes an obvious truth. History is full of such examples. A speaker can make an entire square roar with a few short shouts. A leader can build a heroic image in the eyes of the populace, regardless of their private life or differing realities. A cleverly depicted symbol will stand firm in collective memory, stronger than any logic can achieve. The imaginative power of the crowd also explains why they are easily led into fanaticism. They don't see complex linkages, they only see exaggerated images. Suggestion, when coupled with imagination, becomes an explosive force. It can transform a small event into the start of a revolution or an ordinary person into an untouchable idol. However, this imagination can also create dangerous illusions. A rumor about an enemy, an invisible threat, is enough to make an entire collective tremble and act in a panic. Truth can be crushed because, in the eyes of the crowd, what they perceive through imagination is reality. Once a collective illusion is formed, all reason becomes powerless. When immersed in crowd psychology, people step out of familiar ways of thinking and enter a realm full of paradoxes. There, they are both weak and strong, both blind and creative. The logic that philosophers or scientists use to verify no longer applies. Instead, the guiding force is the stream of imagination, nurtured by suggestion and emotion. Thus, the crowd becomes a magnifying engine of imagination. A word can become a myth, an image can turn into a flame of fanaticism, a symbol can be erected into an undeniable truth. Understanding this, we comprehend why major historical events often begin with a few small but highly symbolic signs. Every belief held by a crowd, whether political, scientific, or social, ultimately takes on the form of a religion. The common thread lies in absolute certainty. Once they believe as if nothing else can coexist. Doubt is not tolerated, dissent is excluded, there is only blind loyalty to what has permeated the collective. The instinct of the crowd always craves an object of worship. It could be an invisible god, a living leader, a flag, or even an abstract symbol. What matters is not the nature of the object, but the power of suggestion it carries. When an image is placed at the center, the crowd immediately builds layers of rituals around it. Repetitive behaviors akin to religious rites. Secular movements have repeatedly demonstrated this. From political waves in Europe to revolutionary movements in various places, the image of a leader is often deified. Portraits hang everywhere, words are quoted as sacred scripture, and death, if it occurs, immediately transforms into martyrdom. A scientific theory, when embraced by the crowd, can also become an unquestionable dogma, despite counterarguments existing elsewhere in academia. In such a state, criticism vanishes, leaving only adoration. A new ideal might replace old deities, but the mechanism of belief remains unchanged. In the past, they bowed before an altar. Today, they bow before a statue. That bowing shares the same essence: collective absolutism. People imagine they have escaped religion, but in the depths of psychology, religion merely changes its attire. What is called religion in a crowd doesn't necessarily need deities. It only requires inviolable symbols and a common system of rituals. A slogan chanted by tens of thousands, repeated until it becomes truth. A flag that each time it waves, evokes the same emotional state. That is the collective ritual, powerful enough to bind disparate individuals into a unified block. Once faith dons the cloak of religion, its power transcends all arguments. People are willing to die for it, kill for it, or sacrifice their entire personal lives to defend it. The crowd doesn't need a rational reason, because for them, belief is no longer a question but destiny. This explains why great movements in history, from revolutions to wars, all carry shades of fanaticism, yet also contain a paradox. The same mechanism can lead to creation or destruction. When collective belief turns towards the ideal of justice, it generates great sacrifices, pulling people beyond their selfish instincts. When collective belief is distorted into hatred, it becomes a flood of fanaticism, burying all traces of reason. Thus, the crowd is both the builder of temples and their destroyer. They always need a symbol to be loyal to, but that symbol can be replaced at any time with just a new, powerful enough suggestion. Today they worship one person. Tomorrow they can drag that person down and erect another idol. This instability makes the crowd's faith both terrifying and alluring. It unleashes immense power, but never guarantees permanence. Looking from the outside, one truth becomes clear. Humans, when merged into a crowd, never escape their religious instinct. Perhaps deities no longer reside on high, but the need to bow, the need to believe in something greater than oneself, remains intact. This is what constitutes both the strength and the danger of the crowd. In the roaring shouts, the raised hands, the eyes drenched in fanaticism, collective belief always takes the form of a sacred ritual. And only when we understand that all convictions of the crowd wear the cloak of religion can we clearly see the operational mechanisms of history. The fires that erupt, the idols erected and then toppled, the streams of people forgetting themselves to follow an invisible call. All collective beliefs do not appear instantaneously. They might seem to erupt in an instant, but in reality, they have been long prepared by remote factor smoldering layers of sediment that we often overlook. These very factors determine an idea's ability to take root, and when the time is right, they enable a minor event to trigger social earthquakes. Race is the most fundamental factor. It is not just a biological concept, but the entire legacy of psychological customs, the unconscious nervous system, accumulated over generations. Each community carries an enduring mold. Latins look to the state as an inevitable support, while Anglo-Saxons rely on individual initiative. From this, we understand why the same slogan of equality or freedom transforms into a multitude of different versions depending on the nation. There is no common formula for all, because the racial heritage limits the trajectory of ideas. Tradition is the next layer. It is both a binding rope and a framework that prevents society from dissolving. Tradition can hold back progress, but it can also serve as a foundation for new ideas to stand firm. In many revolutions, what people imagine to be new is actually just the revival of an old tradition in a different form. Tradition is collective memory. Even when dusty, it cannot be erased. Time is the invisible hand that changes everything. It can make ideas germinate, and it can also cause the most powerful belief to decay. No divine power can escape this law. Brilliant religions, glorious civilizations, once they reach old age, they inevitably crumble. Time is a slow scalpel, gradually cutting away pieces of an ideal, and when the ideal fades, the entire social edifice built upon it begins to waver. Social and political institutions are often revered as the primary causes of upheaval, but in reality, they are merely the surface. Constitutions, laws, parliaments. They only hold value when they align with racial characteristics. When unsuitable, they become soulless corpses, existing on paper but devoid of life in the hearts of the people. True power lies in the collective unconscious foundation, not in written documents. Education is also a factor exaggerated by modern people, but the truth is its impact is often limited. Teaching literacy, teaching skills, can change the outer layer but cannot touch the unconscious core forged over millennia. Moreover, a superficial, formulaic education can produce generations that are adrift, knowing a little, doubting everything, but lacking the power to create. Surface education can sow illusions but cannot replace psychological heritage. All these factors, race, tradition, time, institutions, education, combine to form the foundation of collective belief. Therefore, when we see a movement erupt, do not think it arises from nothing. It is merely the tip of the iceberg, the visible part. The submerged mass beneath is the decisive weight. There are times when a seemingly stable society is suddenly shaken by a new idea. But if we look deeper, we see that this idea has been nurtured for a long time in language, in culture, in folk songs and customs. What is called the surprise of history is actually the maturation of remote factors. When a community's common ideal still shines brightly, they can build an entire civilization. But then time gradually dims that light. Values that were once pillars begin to waver. People, from living for the collective good, gradually return to their small selves. Crowds, having lost their ideals, revert to fragmented assemblages, easily swept away by any wind. The cold truth is that all societies follow this life cycle, from savagery to glory, then from glory to decay. The constant is the law of change, and remote factors are the silent weavers of nations' destinies unstable, yet irresistible. Remote factors are like seeds lying dormant in the soil, but to germinate, they need a drop of rain, a ray of light. These are the immediate factors, short-term agents capable of activating the collective's entire latent power. They do not create belief, but they make belief erupt into action. A sudden event can overturn the situation. An eloquent speech, a chanted slogan, a shocking incidental can cause a previously quiet crowd to explode. But it must be remembered that these triggers are only effective when the groundwork is already laid. Without the preparatory remote factors, all slogans will pass like a breeze. The power of an immediate agent only manifests when it touches a nerve already taut in the collective unconscious. Images and symbols are the sharpest weapons. An event can be dismissed by reason, but a deeply etched image possesses intense suggestive power. Crowds often fail to distinguish between what is seen and what is imagined. A fire erupting in the city, a portrait falling from a wall, a phrase uttered at the right momental become catalysts that unleash long-accumulated emotional currents. Sound and repeated rhythm also hold special power. A simple slogan, when chanted by thousands of voices, becomes an undeniable truth in the eyes of the crowd. People believe not for logical reasons, but due to the weight of resonance. An idea repeated long enough gains power equivalent to an ancient truth. Sometimes, the immediate factor is merely a rumor, but in a prepared atmosphere, that rumor can shake an entire society. Baseless news can lead to stampedes, panic, or even riots. This isn't because crowds are irrational, but because they are ready to believe. So-called fake news only erupts when it aligns with an underlying belief that has been simmering beforehand. The power of immediate factors is their ability to transform potential into momentum. A society can lie dormant for decades, but a sudden event will awaken everything. And then the crowd acts without hesitation, without calculation. They rush in one direction as if guided by an invisible hand. The explosive nature of immediate factors also explains the surprises in history. People often ask why an uprising broke out on this day and not another. The answer: Because on that day, a spark coincided with a fully loaded gunpowder keg. It wasn't that a new idea appeared, but simply that it found a door to escape. Outside observers easily confuse cause and catalyst. They attribute creative power to unexpected events, but in reality, these events merely play the role of an unlock. The essence of collective belief is not born from an immediate agent, but built silently by history. If the foundation is absent, an open door leads nowhere. Therefore, when we see a crowd act abruptly, remember that behind that suddenness is a long process. The immediate factor is merely the needle that pierces the membrane, revealing the accumulated power. The new is often just a display of the old, which has come to its moment of revelation. No collective moves on its own. A crowd may possess energy, but for that energy to transform into action, they need a leader. The leader is the central figure, the one who sets the direction, who gives belief a concrete form. The collective yearns to obey. This seems paradoxical. Each individual in a crowd typically detests imposition when alone, but when merged into the mass, they long for a guiding voice. This is a deep-seated instinct, a vague fear of chaos, a need to lean on a stronger will. A true leader doesn't need complex arguments, but rather an unyielding will and iron conviction. Crowds are persuaded not by meticulous reasoning, but by unwavering spiritual strength. The hesitant and wavering quickly lose control. Conversely, the autocratic individual who asserts absolute truth, acting as if they hold truth in their hand, that is the one who makes the crowd follow. The three main means of persuading a crowd are affirmation, repetition, and contagion. Affirmation, a proposition stated concisely, firmly, allowing no room for doubt. In the eyes of the crowd, decisiveness is more important than right or wrong. Repetition, an idea when repeated over and over, gradually seeps into the unconscious. Repetition is the most effective form of suggestion, as the collective mind rarely resists persistence. Contagion, once an idea takes hold in a few people, it spreads like a chain reaction. The crowd cannot bear the feeling of being left out. They get swept into the current simply because everyone around them believes and acts in the same way. The sharpest tool of the leader is prestige. Prestige is not merely reputation. It is an invisible power that makes words accepted without requiring proof. There is accumulated prestige, stemming from tradition, religion, or long-standing organizations, and personal prestige, which comes from an individual's actions, charisma, or success. Once prestige is established, the crowd listens and believes without deliberation. Prestige is the cloak that makes even an illogical assertion seem obvious. However, prestige is also fragile. It can collapse in a single event, a failure, an unmasking. Crowds turn their backs as quickly as they once cheered. A leader can be deified today, but with just one sign of weakness, tomorrow they can become reviled. A successful leader is one who knows how to combine all three elements: unwavering conviction, the art of suggestion, and prestige. Through these, they transform latent belief into collective conviction, and conviction into action. History has repeatedly witnessed this, from revolutionaries to missionaries, from politicians to military leaders. Crowds need an archetype to believe in, not because they are intellectually inferior, but because the collective imagination requires a focal point. Once established, this archetype can supersede all logic. A person with an iron conviction can alter the course of an entire society, provided the crowd sees in them a symbol of what their unconscious is ready to accept. All collective beliefs have limits to their transformation. They do not drift aimlessly like leaves in the wind. Remote factors have shaped an unconscious framework that makes crowds susceptible to certain types of convictions while resisting others. This framework explains why some seemingly brilliant ideas quickly fade, while other, more fragile ones take root easily and endure. Race and tradition are the most tenacious limits. People can import new laws, new regimes, new slogans. But if they do not align with the instincts deeply embedded in the collective unconscious, they will merely be a layer of fading paint. For example, a people accustomed to living under a centralized regime will find it difficult to immediately absorb the spirit of autonomy. Conversely, a community accustomed to self-governance will resist attempts to impose centralized power. Collective belief can be swayed, but it cannot completely detach from its roots. Social institutions also create invisible boundaries. A long-standing organization not only enacts laws, but also shapes habits, rhythms of life, ways of thinking, and new ideas. If these go against the entire existing structure, they are often rejected or deformed to the point of being unrecognizable. Many reforms fail not due to a lack of ideals, but because they attempt to sever deeply embedded roots. This explains why not every idea gets a chance. In any given era, thousands of ideas are proposed, but only a few find fertile ground. They take root not because they are superior, but because they align with the existing framework in the collective unconscious. The crowd's selection is not based on logic, but on an invisible compatibility with its long-standing heritage. A leader, no matter how talented, cannot transcend these limits. They can ignite and fan flames, but they cannot create a belief entirely alien to the collective's nature. Their power, though seemingly absolute, is in reality borrowed from the deep-seated factors already present. When they attempt to impose something contrary to that foundation, they will quickly be rejected, even overthrown by the very crowd they lead. Viewing the whole picture, the transformation of collective belief is like a river. Its surface may ripple and its course may temporarily shift, but the riverbed maintains its main direction. Storms only cause the water to rise, but once they subside, the river continues along its old path. History is dynamic, but beneath the ripples, there are silent trajectories that determine humanity's course. When connecting the analyzed layers' long-term foundations, immediate triggers, leaders, and persuasive techniques, we clearly see that great events are not the product of a singular will. They are the consequence of a chain of interactions. Remote factors prepare, immediate factors ignite, leaders shape, and all are limited by the framework of collective heritage. History, therefore, is rarely absolute creation, but often the manifestation of what has long smoldered, waiting. The hard truth to accept is that humans are less free than they imagine. Individuals may delude themselves into believing they are choosing, but these choices are largely shaped by unconscious heritage. The larger the crowd, the more fragile the illusion of freedom. What is called transformation is merely oscillation within the amplitude permitted by the collective unconscious. When we realize this, we understand that holding power is not truly about slogans, laws, or speeches, but about understanding the limits of belief transformation. The one who knows how they are speaking to a collective soul that has already been shaped, that person can lead. The one who thinks they can impose ideas outside this framework, that person is merely sowing seeds on stone. All classifications of crowds begin with the most primitive image, a random, diverse assembly of people. They might come from different races, temporarily united by a leader's command, much like the barbarian hordes that invaded the Roman Empire. Their existence was based solely on coercive force and immediate power, without any psychological bond. But when these individuals live together for extended periods, influenced by history and heritage, they gradually acquire common characteristics, forming a race with a distinct collective instinct. It is in this transition from a diverse aggregate to a psychological crowd that the true power of the community emerges, no longer a mechanical assembly, but the crystallization of synchronized unconscious emotions. I divide crowds into two broad groups, heterogeneous and homogeneous. This classification is not based on outward appearance, but on their psychology and operational mechanisms. Within the heterogeneous group, two notable types exist. Anonymous. These are street crowds, protests, riots, where each person dissolves into anonymity, shedding individual responsibility. They act impulsively, driven by emotion, easily prone to rage, and highly susceptible to suggestion. The feeling of lost responsibility makes them willing to do what they would never dare to do alone. Non-anonymous. These are assemblages like juries or parliamentary assemblies. Each individual still appears under a specific name, but remains influenced by collective psychology. Here, the unconscious power doesn't vanish, but is moderated by a sense of responsibility regarding a common issue. These two types of crowds can react differently simply due to the factor of anonymity or its absence. Within the homogeneous group, we observe three main forms. Sects bound by absolute belief. Whether religious or political, their essence is the communal spirit of conviction. Once joined, individuals live and die for dogma, leaving no room for doubt. Castes such as military, clergy, or artisan classes. Here, tradition and profession create boundaries. The persistence of a caste stems from its ability to both maintain internal discipline and exclude outsiders. Social classes, like the middle class, peasants, or small traders. This homogeneity is less rigid but still forms a distinct psychology. The middle class is often associated with reason and stability, while peasants are linked to patience and attachment to the land. These social strata form the long-term foundations of society. The deepest influence on the nature of crowds is race. A crowd of Latins, whether conservative or revolutionary, will always seek the hand of the state, yearning for centralized power. In contrast, the British or Americans instinctively rely on individual initiative and the idea of freedom. A French crowd often venerates equality. An English crowd prioritizes freedom above all else. These differences demonstrate that each people, when merging into a crowd, still carries the ingrained racial unconscious within their soul. It is also important to remember that the character of a crowd becomes more pronounced when the racial factor weakens. Peoples with long-standing traditions and a firm collective spirit are generally less prone to being swept into chaotic crowd states. Conversely, where the foundation is weak, crowds easily revert to a savage instinct. A crowd at its lowest level is a regression to a primitive state. Only when a race is strong enough to build a common spirit can society escape the vortex of the collective unconscious. This classification is not intended to diminish individual value, but to expose the secret power that dominates history. Looking back, we see that all great upheavals are linked to these seemingly invisible masses of people. Whether it's riots, revolutions, or the enduring nature of a social class, all bear the imprint of the crowd mechanism. When the law labels a collective as criminal, we often only see the surface of violence. But if we peel back the outer layer and observe the underlying psychological mechanism, we will realize something different. When a crowd is subjected to suggestion and pushed to its extreme, their behavior is not necessarily irrational, but a rationalization according to collective thought, a primitive, raw form of reasoning, yet sufficient for them to believe in it. The nature of criminal crowds is impulsiveness. They do not plan like calculating individuals, nor do they weigh pros and cons. All it takes is a trigger, a rumor, a hostile glance, an inciting slogan for all their latent energy to erupt. People who are normally gentle in their private lives can, when in a crowd, become merciless killers. This change is not because they transform into different people, but because they are divested of responsibility and dissolved into the collective. Reason in these moments is replaced by extreme images and emotions. The crowd sees an action and immediately believes in the meaning it carries. They rationalize cruelty with arguments so simple they are naive. Killing traitors saves the country. Tormenting enemies instills fear to keep the community safe. They believe because such belief reduces insecurity and increases conformity. History records many horrific illustrations. During the September massacres in Paris, people not only killed in silence but turned it into a collective amusement. Tired guards stopped, and surrounding citizens stepped in to take their place as if everyone should have a share. Some even cheerfully sipped wine while victims were executed before their eyes. When the deed was done, some casually went to authorities to claim rewards, believing they had performed a righteous duty. Here, cruelty and innocence go hand in hand because the crowd created its own logic. This mechanism can give rise to both crime and heroism within the same collective psychology. If suggested in a different direction, it can transform ordinary people into those willing to sacrifice for the community. They can destroy together, but also protect together. The difference lies not in the crowd's structure, but in the current of suggestion guiding them. The problem is that once swept away, crowds do not stop at individual limits in their cruel acts. They want to prolong the moment, to share it so that evil becomes a ritual. In heroic acts, they want to amplify the sacrifice, as if only when the entire collective suffers pain does the ideal become sacred. At both extremes, crowds lose the ability to perceive things as discrete individuals. When we call them criminals, that is true at a legal level, but on a deeper plane, they are merely people stripped of their fragile layer of reason, exposing ancient instincts. Criminal crowds are structurally no different from heroic crowds. The only difference is the direction in which suggestion has pushed them. Understanding this, we do not condone violence, but we clearly see the mechanism that created it. Anger, fanaticism, schadenfreude are multiplied by countless nods of agreement around them. Each person in the crowd believes they are acting with the collective, and it is this synchronicity that makes the inconceivable possible. There is a type of crowd that is not easily labeled as hysterical or criminal. It assumes a solemn form, entering social life under the name of a jury. At first glance, this is just a group of ordinary people randomly selected. But when they sit together in a courtroom, they become a special collective, a non-anonymous crowd bound by legal and moral responsibility, unlike street crowds. A jury retains some of each individual's personality. Each person has a name, profession, and social standing. Anonymity dissolves. This makes them less prone to instant extremism than other crowds. Nevertheless, collective psychology still emerges. They seek consensus. They are influenced by the most vocal among them. They waver according to the simplified reasoning of the group. The collective nature within a jury does not disappear. It merely takes on a more dignified form. Here, the roles of prosecutor and judge have a profound influence. Complex trials, with mountains of evidence and intricate legal language, often make it impossible for jurors to grasp everything on their own. They lean on the prosecutor's guidance. They trust the judge's authority. Often, one might ask whose responsibility it truly is, the jury or those orchestrating the courtroom. Yet, even when influenced, juries possess a unique humanistic function. It is this collective of ordinary people that tempers the cold harshness of the law. The law, being literal and blind to circumstances, knows only its articles. But a jury, through intuition and compassion, can lean towards leniency when a verdict seems too severe. It is here that the collective gives the law a human face. It is difficult to replace the role of a jury with a single individual. A professional judge may be sharp in reasoning, but can easily become a cold instrument of the written word. A jury, with its mixture of different people, is rarely perfect but closer to living justice. They make mistakes, but their mistakes often carry a breath of humanity, not the closed-off cruelty of a system. More broadly, a crowd can be persuaded, whereas a caste cannot. If put on trial and given a choice, many would prefer to face a jury rather than a panel of professional judges. Because there, even if random and inexperienced, there's a chance for human empathy to intervene. A jury's mistake might acquit a guilty person, but it can also save an individual from the mechanical blade of the law. In the entirety of collective life, the jury is a rare testament that not all crowds are blind. Sometimes, the combination of many non-expert perspectives creates the necessary flexibility to keep society less cruel. And that is why, despite criticisms, this institution persists as a symbol of justice that is more accessible, more commonplace. Leaving the courtroom and entering political life, the crowd manifests in another form: elections and parliamentary assemblies. Here, they no longer wield clubs or sit in wooden court benches, but the psychological mechanism retains its fundamental nature. In elections, the decisive role belongs to words and slogans. Crowds do not analyze complex programs or dry statistics. They are captivated by concise, memorable, and emotionally resonant phrases: freedom, equality, civil rights, social justice. Each word acts like an amulet, concealing internal ambiguity but erupting with suggestive power. Crowds do not demand precise definitions, they need resonance images, rhythms. The personal prestige of a candidate also carries decisive weight. Crowds rarely choose someone similar to themselves. They are attracted by a transcendent image, a strong personality, a resounding name. A favored candidate is not necessarily chosen for clear ideals, but for the image he or she evokes. As in any collective, they believe in someone they can worship. Real power in elections often lies not with the voters, but with committees, small groups hidden behind the collective curtain, manipulating public opinion, shaping slogans, and coordinating finances. This is a subtle form of tyranny. Instead of being overt, it wears the cloak of the collective, transforming individual power into the invisible power of all. The tyranny of a minority hiding behind the populace is the most dangerous because it leaves no identifiable face to confront. Universal suffrage is one of the great myths of the modern era. Everyone knows it does not guarantee truth, yet it is worshipped as an undeniable dogma. A single vote does not make a farmer more knowledgeable about national finance, but it is the imagination of equality that creates psychological value. What is frightening is not its imperfection, but that it exists as a religion that cannot be denied, only believed. From elections, we move to parliamentary assemblies, a form of non-anonymous crowd. Here, individuals with names and positions enter the hall, but when merging into the collective, they behave like a classic crowd. Intellect is simplified, emotions are exaggerated, and the strongest voices quickly dominate. The role of the leader in parliament is almost absolute. A highly prestigious figure with a few firm affirmations can sway the entire assembly. Members of parliament, seemingly rational, are easily led, no different from street crowds. They react to the sound of a voice, to images evoked in their minds, rather than to the logic of arguments. Oratory here is the art of crowd control, not through complex reasoning, but through three familiar weapons: concise affirmations, evocative images, and rhythmic phrases. A good speaker can transform a vague idea into an iron conviction in just a few minutes, simply because the words are released at the right time, in the right place, with the power of personal prestige. All of this shows that whether in the solemn forms of politics or law, a crowd is still a crowd. They carry within them the same mechanism: easily susceptible to suggestion, quick to trust prestige, prone to exaggerated emotions, and always in need of a leader. Elections or parliaments, after all, are just stages where collective instinct dons the attire of ritual. As these pages close, what lingers is not events but a chilling sensation. It turns out that most of us, when immersed in the collective, are no longer truly ourselves. Individual intelligence can vanish in a unanimous shout. Cautious doubts are swept away by a firm assertion. The prudent I recedes to make way for the collective instinct. The deepest lesson is that a crowd is not the sum of many reasons, but the amplification of the unconscious. We often mistakenly believe that the more people deliberate together, the greater the wisdom. But the truth is often the opposite. The more individuals, the easier it is for them to dissolve. And a new mind is born, the mind of the collective, full of emotion but lacking analysis. From this, a question arises. When you are lost in a crowd, are you still free? Is the freedom we so cherish merely an illusion when the collective unconscious has quietly decided for us beforehand? Perhaps in many cases, what we call individual will is just the echo of the crowd in our heads. Yet the paradox is that without crowds, history would not advance. Great movements, revolutions, collective creative explosions all are products of the crowd mind. Collective power is both a danger and a driving force. Through it, we can build civilizations, but also because of it, we can sow devastation. If so, the lesson is not to deny the crowd, but to learn to see through it. Never believe you're completely immune to suggestion. Ask yourself, why do I believe this? Does this belief come from reason, or simply because I hear it repeated by tens of thousands of other mouths? Perhaps true freedom is not retreating from the collective, but maintaining the ability to observe, even when merged into a sea of people. As I put this book down, I want to leave you with a necessary skepticism. Who are you when standing in a crowd? Do you still retain yourself? Or have you become a piece of another intelligence, invisible yet powerful? And if one day you realize you are shouting, cheering, or raging exactly like thousands around you, will you have the courage to stop, look at that crowd, and recognize the mechanism that controls everything? That question is not easy to answer, but that very discomfort is the reward. For if you still wonder, you have not been completely swept away. And sometimes, just one person remaining lucid in a sea of people is enough to open up another possibility for the future.